Joining us now from Geneva is Bill Freilich, the Director of Human Rights Watch's Refugee Program, and from Amman, Jordan is Joel Eid, the Communications Officer with the United Nations World Food Programme. Thanks to both of you for being with us. Joel, how has the World Food Programme got itself into a situation where it can no longer provide food vouchers to almost 2 million Syrian refugees?
Well, the reality is that on the 1st of December, WFP ran out of funds, and we had to announce that we were suspending food assistance, unfortunately, to 1.7 million refugees that are living in the region neighboring to Syria and countries neighboring to Syria. Well, the reality is that in a week's time, today we also announced that we were able to raise only in a week $80 million from donations from the public, from governments and private institutions. This is the money that we will need to sustain our operations, and therefore the 1.7 million refugees will in fact be receiving food assistance again this month, and this is a wonderful news.
Bill, that is good news, but this appears to be a disaster without end. You know, just when we think it can't get any worse, it does. Now we have a food crisis. What is the impact of this food crisis on the millions of refugees? I mean, are we looking at starvation now, in addition to all the other problems that these refugees face?
Well, we've certainly seen indications of severe malnutrition in parts of Syria itself, or the internally displaced people. Thankfully, we haven't seen that level of hunger in the surrounding countries. But I think the food vouchers were more than just food. It was a way of providing support by the host communities, which is sorely in need. The numbers of refugees is just overwhelming to those communities, and our real fear at this point is that some of the neighboring countries, Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey in particular, are going to close their doors to any new refugee inflows, and that would be disastrous, of course, for the more than 6.5 million internally displaced people inside Syria, and larger numbers of people that may yet need to flee the country.
Joel, is that a real danger that these countries could close their doors to more refugees? And insofar as the refugees who are being affected right now, what are you hearing from them?
Well, first of all, when it comes to host countries, those countries have been handling a burden of over 3 million refugees registered with the UN Refugee Agency for almost 4 years. And without additional support from the international community, these countries will not be able to sustain this huge number of people that require shelter, food, medicine, and other forms of assistance. We are deeply concerned with regards to the situation of refugees. If WFP does not get sustainable funding in the next year, we will again be forced to suspend, even if temporarily. And our concerns include refugees being forced to get their children out of school. We would see an increase in child labor, malnutrition, of course. Many refugees have told us that they would prefer going back to Syria, even if it's not safe, if they do not get the assistance on a regular basis.
Bill, when we look at this crisis, and it is indeed a very big crisis, you've seen other crises around the world, refugee crisis. Is this any different?
I mean, the scale is immense, and added to the Syrian displacement, we have the displacement coming out of Iraq, where some of the lines between the two countries are blurred by the situation that's causing people to flee. And at the same time that we have this crisis happening in the Middle East, we have very significant refugee crises happening in South Sudan, the Central African Republic. We have the Ebola crisis in West Africa, not to mention long-term chronic situations like the situation of Somali refugees in the Dadaab and Kakuma camps in Kenya, where WFP a few months ago was announcing food ration cuts there as well. So while the cameras may be trained on the Syria situation, which deservedly warrants the attention of the world community, many of the places I just mentioned, like South Sudan, Central African Republic, Kenya, get far less attention, and the needs there are very compelling as well.
Joel, you wanted to talk about how much of a bigger challenge this particular crisis poses for the World Food Programme.
Well, I mean, as my colleague here just said, this is by far the worst humanitarian crisis that WFP has had to deal with in recent history. And just the number, the amount of displacement and the effects both on the nationals of the countries that are hosting these refugees is just immense. At the same time, WFP is having to deal with 5 other high-level emergencies around the world, like Ebola, like South Sudan. And this is also adding strain on donor countries in terms of how funding is distributed.
Bill, we have a food crisis right now. What is the danger of this escalating into a bigger humanitarian crisis? We just heard from Joel a moment ago telling us that in many instances, parents are being forced to take their kids out of school. We're hearing of kids getting married at a very young age, you know, these child marriages. And in some cases, there have been sexual exploitation as well. I mean, when we look at all of this, can it get a lot worse?
I'm afraid so. I mean, 1 out of 4 people in Lebanon today is a refugee. Lebanon does not, unlike Jordan, does not have the sort of formalized camp structure that we've seen in both Jordan and Turkey. Shelter is a critical problem in Lebanon, and the food vouchers, of course, were extremely important for helping people to maintain themselves as what are called urban refugees. But we found that at a municipal level in Lebanon, there's been violence directed towards refugees. The country itself is quite unstable politically and economically, and the refugees are bearing the brunt of the destabilization that Lebanon itself is experiencing. So the possibility that destabilization in the region spreads, or that refugees become scapegoated as causes of the misery that a lot of people in local host communities themselves are feeling, is a grave concern that we have at the moment.
Joel, you mentioned a moment ago that one of the ways these refugees are trying to cope with this is, in some instances, to return to Syria, to these devastated towns and cities from which they came. I mean, what would they face there if they return?
Well, definitely, we don't so far see a wave of refugees going back to Syria, but this is one of the answers that refugees give us when we ask them, what would it mean to you if this assistance stopped, if you stopped receiving food assistance or health assistance? And this is one of the answers that they give. And this really represents, the difficult time that these people are living away from home. I remember one woman once said, my husband would force us to go back to Syria, even if it's not safe, because if we're going to be hungry either way, we'd rather be hungry in our own country.
And Bill, how has the international community been responding to this crisis?
Well, I mean, a lot of money has been contributed to the humanitarian effort, but the scale of the problem outpaces the generosity, let's say, of the international community. And then there's the question of sharing the human burden. We really have had very low offers for refugee resettlement to help relieve the burden, to show solidarity with the neighboring countries. The European Union, with the exception of Germany, really has been very, very slow to respond with very small numbers. The country that I come from, the United States, similarly has actually admitted very, very low numbers of refugees from Syria. The last I checked, it was in double digits, less than 100 from the beginning of the crisis. Now the U.S. says that it is committed to bringing more in, but it's a very slow process, and the international community has not responded, geared up in a way that shows this to be the international crisis of the scale that it actually is. And so giving money is only part of the response, but it's a complex humanitarian emergency, and it needs to be approached at every level.
Joel, as we heard just a moment ago from our reporter, winter is approaching in this particular part of the world. Conditions are going to get a lot rougher, a lot more challenging. Is the WFP prepared for this?
Well, winter has already hit these areas. It's actually really cold in the Middle East right now. We have even snow in some parts of Lebanon and some countries. We are actually really concerned. What we're hoping for in December, on December 18th in Berlin, the international community, humanitarian agencies, over 200 of them, and host countries will be launching the 7th regional appeal for donor states in hopes that more funding comes for next year. We want donor states to remember that the Syria crisis is not over. And while the solution for it is political, we are hoping that something happens real soon. Over 4 million people inside Syria are in need of food assistance every month, over 3 million in the region. And without continued assistance, we will not be able to help them.
Bill, what's the prospect? What's the outlook for the near-term future for these refugees? You know, as we heard right at the beginning of this interview, some money has come in. Are you hopeful that more money will come in the new year?
Well, as I said, it's not just a question of money coming in, it's a question of money that keeps pace with the scale of the problem. And we have seen no diminution in the crisis. It just hasn't, it hasn't stopped growing, and it's gotten worse and worse. And certainly when you look at the political prospects for resolution, we don't see anything on the horizon anytime soon, unfortunately. And so it really means that the humanitarians have a huge job ahead of them. It's a very steep hill to climb, and it's something that is causing enormous concern. And as I said before, if the result ends up being that the neighboring countries close their borders, which they've already really started to do, I mean, the restrictions are much harsher now than they were several months ago. We're really concerned the impact that this is going to have on people that really need to flee for their lives and will not have an avenue open to them to escape the danger that they face.
Belle Freilich, Joel Eid, thanks to both of you for joining us.